Welcome to the MEF2C Cast, a podcast dedicated to educating, supporting, and building community around MEF2C haploinsufficiency syndrome.
The MEF2C Cast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Views expressed are those of the host and guests and not necessarily of the podcast or its sponsors. This is not medical advice. Consult a healthcare professional for medical concerns.
Hi everybody, welcome to the MEF2C Cast. I'm your host Eli. We've got a great episode for you this week. Our guest was Dr. Wendy Chung, a really brilliant and talented researcher working on MEF2C. Because Dr. Chung is so brilliant and talented, she could only spare a half hour of her time for our interview. She's a very busy woman. So I just wanted to jump on here and use this extra time we had to kind of correct and clarify a couple of mistakes that we made through our first few episodes, give you some kind of updates on what's going on with the show and kind of how we're going to do the show going forward. So nothing crazy's changing, but just kind of take care of some housekeeping stuff. So firstly, the corrections. So in our first episode where we did the overview of MCHS, one glaring mistake that we made is that we completely did not talk about duplications. So duplications are another kind of genetic variation that can occur within MCHS. So the last thing we want to do is make anyone feel forgotten or not seen. So we just wanted to get on here and make sure that we said that duplications are also a genetic variation within MCHS and make sure that we set that so that all the information is complete. Another thing from that first episode is that I said that people with deletions have more severe symptoms than people with just variations. And while that at a very, very broad general level may be true, it's an oversimplification. So, when you're dealing with a disorder that is as complex and new as MCHS, sometimes there's not a lot of data and you kind of have to make generalizations just because that's the best you can do with the information that you have. But we shouldn't be oversimplifying things any more than we have to. So there's an old saying, keep it as simple as you can, but no simpler. So going forward, because I'm the one who does most of the pre-production, I will try to be as precise and accurate as possible when giving you guys information about MCHS. That doesn't mean I won't make more mistakes, because I probably will, but all I can do is try to get a little bit better every time. Another mistake that we made is speaking with Aaliyah and Meredith. We spoke about how Bo, Aaliyah's son, and Leo, my son, how their genetic variation is in the same place. And I kind of intimated that because their variations were in the same place, that they would have kind of the same developmental trajectory. And that's not necessarily true. I was under the impression before that conversation that Leo and Bo had the exact same genetic mutation in the exact same place. That was my mistake. It was a misunderstanding on my part, and that wasn't true. So Aaliyah corrected me in the episode you'll hear, and then we just kind of moved on. But, just because having the variation in the same place doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have the same outcome, but it doesn't mean that they will either. You can't really assume either way. So I just wanted to get on here and make sure that we made that clear. And as I said before, going forward, we'll try to be more careful with generalizations and oversimplifications and things like that, so that the information we're giving you is as true as it can be. So now we'll move on to some updates about the show. We recently posted in anticipation of our upcoming interview with Dr. Cowan, we posted in the Facebook group asking for questions for our interview. And there were a lot. All of the questions were really good. Many of the things were things that I had thought about. So to give you guys a little peek behind the curtain, I do most of the pre-production. So I'm responsible for booking guests and then kind of writing the outline of our episodes, kind of laying out what we're going to talk about with who. And then Haley does most of the post-production. So she edits the episodes and then posts them. She handles the social media stuff for the page. But so I was going through all those questions and, like I said, all of them were great. And, we have a limited amount of time with any given guest. So sometimes it can be difficult to make sure that every specific question gets covered. And sometimes it can be difficult to fit all those questions within the hour. And then a lot of the questions are really broad. So you're asking about a lot of different things, and it can be kind of difficult to cover any one subject as deeply as it needs to be covered if you're trying to cover all these different subjects within one episode. So we're kind of doing a little bit of a new, not necessarily a format with the show itself, but just kind of the way we do things going forward. So we're going to move our episode drop day to Fridays. So they will drop on Fridays now instead of Thursdays. And then on Fridays, we will also make a Q&A post on Facebook. So these will be general Q&A posts for questions in general, just anything you have about MCHS, or if you have a suggestion about a topic we should cover or a guest we should have on, you can throw those all in that post every Friday. And then Haley and I will go through those, and our job will be to figure out what subjects you guys want to hear about and make sure the appropriate questions get in front of the appropriate guests. So this will help us kind of make the most out of any given episode while still ensuring that the questions that everybody has gets answered. And, for example, in the questions for the Dr. Cowan episode, one thing that was a huge blind spot for me was seizures because, knock on wood, Leo hasn't had any seizure issues at all. So that's just something that I don't think about. But about 80% of people with MCHS have some sort of epilepsy profiles. Obviously for a lot of parents, that's a really important topic, and it should be. If Leo had seizures, of course, that would be something that was very important to me. But that was a huge blind spot for me, because it was just something I didn't think about. So that alone has been really valuable in going through those questions. So I went through and reformatted our outline to put more of an emphasis on seizures and seizure activity with Dr. Cowan. Or Cowan, excuse me. So it'll kind of be things like that where we may not cover your specific question exactly word for word, but we'll make sure that the subjects that you were worried about and the situations that you're worried about are covered in some capacity. And as always, if you have any questions at any time, if you want to be a guest, please contact us on Facebook or email us at MEF2CAST@gmail.com, and we'd love to talk to you. Anyone out there at all in the community who is interested in being a guest, we would love to have you on. We've had a lot of people say that they feel like they're not interesting enough to be a guest, and I can assure you, just as a byproduct of having to care for someone with MCHS, your life's extraordinarily interesting, and we want to talk to you. So, anyone at all who wants to be a guest, reach out to us, and we'll try to make it happen. So, we'll throw it over to our interview now. So our guest this week was Dr. Wendy Chung. Dr. Wendy Chung is a pediatric geneticist and chair of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and a researcher studying neurogenetic conditions like MEF2C. Alrighty, welcome to the MEF2C cast. We are here with Dr. Wendy Chung, who is the chief of pediatrics at Boston Children's. A geneticist who researches MEF2C, among many other things. How are you this morning?
I'm doing very well.
Can you start by just telling us a little bit how you got involved with MEF2C research?
Sure. So I'm a medical geneticist, a pediatrician who takes care of diagnosis and takes care of people with genetic conditions. And MEF2C, it always for me starts with a patient and ends with a patient. And I diagnosed and have subsequently diagnosed many patients with MEF2C mutations. And with this, I get frustrated, as families do, when our current clinical care can't provide all the answers and all the supports that we'd like to have. So I use research in addition to clinical care to try and answer those questions and come up with solutions where we have gaps in our care. So anyway, it takes a while to do this, but it's a real pleasure to be able to work with families and partner with them as we do it together.
Yeah, it's great to have a scientist of your caliber working on it, frankly. Can you give us a brief overview of MCHS, both in terms of the disorder and the actual MEF2C protein itself and what it does in the body?
Sure. So I'll start with a little bit of the basic science for MEF2C. We use the term transcription factor, but the way to think about this is that as people, we have about 20,000 genes, and that same information is in each one of the cells in our body, but different cells use different genes. They don't use the entire encyclopedia. And so there needs to be a conductor basically orchestrating and decide which instrument should play at what time and how loudly and how quickly, and coordinate everything together. So I think of MEF2C and other transcription factors as being some of those conductors. And this is complicated because it's not just simply the different part of the body, but there's also an element of time, and for children, an element of development. So this coordination has to occur across multiple dimensions. And in particular, this developmental aspect is very important for MEF2C in brain development and how brain cells are born, how they move, how they connect. And MEF2C is one of those critical conductors for putting all of that information together.
I really like that analogy of a conductor. I've thought a lot about, like, you know, and explaining this to other people, analogies to use. I've never thought of that one, but that one's really good. Why is MCHS so underdiagnosed?
So, number one is that the technologies available to make these diagnoses have only been available relatively recently. So, what I mean by that is, although the gene has been known for a while, the clinical condition ascribed to genetic variants in that gene is a relative new discovery. So, I'm sure there are individuals who are, for instance, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s with the condition who are not being diagnosed. They're just wherever they are, and they're not aware of these new technologies to make the diagnosis. And truth be told, and I want to be fair about this, there's not anything immediately we can do to fix the gene. And so with that, there hasn't been this drive or motivation necessarily for all those adults out there to get a diagnosis. The technology, the other thing to think about is that mutations in this gene look similar to mutations in many other genes, in the sense that at a very high level, individuals are characterized by challenges in terms of how their brain functions: cognitive challenges, developmental challenges, coordination challenges, and epilepsy in some cases. And there are many different genes that have that same set of manifestations. And so it's hard to be able to make the diagnosis with efficiency unless you're able to bundle all of those different genetic conditions all in one test. And that type of test has really only been available for the last 10 years and really only covered by insurance widely for even less time, perhaps even for some insurances the last 5 years or so. So with that, many of the people who've been diagnosed are, number one, parents and or their doctors driving the diagnosis, but tending to be for people that are younger. So most of the individuals who've been diagnosed are age less than 10 is the majority. There are some individuals in their teenage years, but largely younger children. Again, that doesn't mean that they're the only people out there. They're just the ones who have sort of grown up or been born or been at an age when they were seeing doctors, wondering the question about what was the underlying cause of these symptoms in an era when the diagnostic tools were available, and available in terms of insurance coverage. Of course, there are also differences around the world in terms of, even if this technology is available in the United States, it may not be available in all parts of the world. And although I think this condition is probably equal opportunity for individuals around the world, we don't, when we look globally at who's been diagnosed, we don't see all parts of the world equally represented, as I said, because it takes a fair bit of time for this to roll out and for everyone to have access. I think, as I alluded to, as we have more understanding of the condition, and in particular, as we have better supports and treatment, I think it will drive demand, so to speak. So in other words, the information will be more valuable, and with the value, more people will realize that this may be helpful. And it's true not just for MEF2C, but it actually is true across these lookalike conditions, so that as treatments become available for any, or I hope all of these conditions, it'll really drive the motivation to get a diagnosis and get a very precise and accurate diagnosis, because that gene and that specific variant may be targeted by the therapies that come forward. So it may be necessary to know that information to get access to the right treatments and to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Do you think that because there's so much overlap between things that, like autism and MCHS, that another contributing factor is that things might be diagnosed clinically and you just never pursue a genetic test because it doesn't seem like it's necessary.
Yeah, that's another way of saying, I think, some of the same things I were saying. So, as an example, not everyone, but many people have an autism diagnosis. And when you think about what sometimes can be helpful in terms of accessing resources, so whether it's ABA therapy or other types of therapy or in an IEP for a school-based program, an autism diagnosis oftentimes is helpful in terms of framing what supports may be beneficial. And so, just to be clear, because I know this is confusing, I think of autism as clinical behavioral diagnosis, and it's really in parallel, but a completely different dimension than if we think about a genetic diagnosis. So some individuals with autism have a MEF2C mutation, and some people with a MEF2C mutation have autism, but it's not 100% overlap between the two. But on the other hand, as you were pointing out, having an autism diagnosis without any of the dimensionality of genetics can be helpful in terms of getting the right supports, especially, as I said, from an educational and therapeutic point of view.
Right.
I do think, though, just to put it out there, there is going to be a future state, and we need to start preparing now for that future state to prepare for potential new treatments, even to the specificity of the DNA letter that may need to be altered. And if we don't stand up and get counted now, it's hard to be able to prepare for that future state. And it may be that we don't drive the scientists who are working on those treatments in the right direction. In other words, if they're trying to think about how many people are out there and should I bother working on this? And in particular for companies that have to decide about investing resources as a business, I have a concern that many conditions are, I'll use the term, too rare to care.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is it's certainly not my opinion that they're too rare to care, but companies making very tough decisions in very tough financial times do have to make a business decision about what is the frequency of the condition, how many people are out there who might benefit from this as they're making tough decisions about where to put their resources. So it's really important for us to get our numbers counted, having people diagnosed in this dimension, understanding the age distribution and understanding what those challenges are so we can prepare for those future clinical trials and be able to, like I said, be represented and not undercounted.
Yeah. Well, you answered my next question before I could even ask it. So that's perfect. So, can you just sort of take us through the current landscape of MCHS research as you see it in terms of what we know and sort of the biggest mysteries that we need to be working on in the immediate future?
Sure. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I'd say there's more that we don't know, and that is more questions than we have answers at this point. And that's not surprising. I don't want people to be discouraged by that, but this is a relatively new clinical condition. So we're really in our infancy, maybe even embryonic state in terms of our understanding. And it takes time to do that. The good news is that science is accelerating. We're learning from other transcription factors, other neurodevelopmental conditions, and so we're picking up tips and tricks from those others and building upon that. There are real synergies, and in particular in Simon Searchlight, which is one of the studies we run, we try and pick up on those synergies and have economies of scale. So in other words, not everyone has to do the same things over and over again. We can learn it once and apply those learnings many times over. I think one of the big and probably one of the most important factors for me is where in the body is MEF2C acting. It's clearly acting in the brain, and it has a very important and I think we might all think the most important role in the brain. But as I think about lifelong, because I do think even though many of you have children, those children are going to grow up, and I wonder about the role of MEF2C around the rest of the body as well. There's reason to believe in the muscle. It's playing a role, and so I'm needing to think about where in the body, for instance, if we were to target therapy, where does that therapy need to go? Does it only need to go in the brain, or does it need to go in the muscle? There are muscles around the body, obviously. There are muscles in the heart. So I think about that as a fundamental question. I also think about windows of opportunity when I think about treatment. Certainly when I think about supports, lifelong supports in terms of educational strategies, communication strategies, all of those we can continue doing regardless. But if I think of something that might be a medicine or might be a genetically based therapy, in general, I think that the younger we treat, probably lifelong, the bigger the impact will be. I just don't know exactly what that curve looks like. In other words, do we have a window of treatment opportunity that goes up until till age 50? Do we get most of the benefit if we do it before age 10? I just don't know the answer to that question. None of us do. It's an important question. And as I said, and as you alluded to, understanding what the condition looks like over the life course is really important. And so I will admit, I don't know how to do this exactly, but maybe some of you listening do. How do we sort of rally the troops for those over age 20 who may have MEF2C mutations? How do we, get to those individuals who are not necessarily part of the same sort of community and easy to locate and communicate with? Not that they don't want to listen, but they're just distributed. They're not quite as concentrated in places where they know about what's going on in terms of this research. So that's an important question to me. And many of the research studies that have many adults in them have actually been difficult to have individuals with disabilities included. And so as a result, they're not in many of those studies, things like All of Us and other very large either US or international studies. And so it's been hard to get data on those individuals, but that ultimately would be a real gift, as I said, to help us navigate what we do for our young people, and especially as they transition to become adults.
Yeah, I think the inclusion of the adults is important too, because frankly, and like you said, we're just so deficient on data. When you initially receive the diagnosis, sort of the prognosis for their life is pretty bleak. I mean, they may never walk, they may never speak, things like this. And we have come across, and our diagnosis will have been a year in May. And we've come across multiple adults, one who's a speller who can communicate, who graduated with his high school diploma. Another parent I talked to, their kid can, speak well enough to have conversations, has a part-time job at a grocery store. So I don't think it's the doctor's fault that they're giving us this bleak diagnosis. I just don't think they have as much information as they could. Hopefully, as those adults get included, sort of the capabilities of these people will become a little more well known. I know that MEF2C plays a role in cardiac tissue during development. Does that seem to also have an effect throughout life, or is that just primarily in development?
It's a good question. And again, I think you would be great in terms of helping to make that research agenda going forward. I don't know that we know. The types of places where we get our current information are, we call them natural history studies, but it's, in other words, identifying people with mutations in MEF2C, making it as easy as possible for as many people to participate as much as they're comfortable with, and then following them over time. That's what I meant when I talked about a natural history study. And so with Simon Searchlight, for instance, as an easy way for people to do that online and around the world, so it's as accessible as possible. We haven't been seeing cardiac issues coming up. So to answer your question directly, it's not as if we've done echocardiograms or direct analysis or direct interrogation of the heart, but based on what people are telling us, we haven't seen that as a major factor going forward. So we do have in-person assessments as well, because we realize that maybe everyone doesn't know what's happening inside their body. And we focus most of those in-person assessments here at Boston Children's Hospital with behavioral and cognitive and brain tasks to start with. That's clearly what parents have been telling us is the highest priority, so that's where we focused our attention. But to your point, we have the ability as a community to think collectively together. Would it be useful to look at a few people, especially older people, in terms of looking directly at their heart by, without doing anything that's hurtful or harmful, literally looking at their heart and looking at their heart function and seeing if it looks normal? That would be helpful to the next generation going forward. So I could imagine if the community together, collectively, we said that would be a good idea, let's check it out. We have the infrastructure to be able to do things like that and answer those questions. So good question. Let's, as a group, figure out if that's important enough for us to now start answering.
So what, if any, potential treatments are on the horizon, and how are those implemented? Because frankly, like when I hear about CRISPR or gene therapy or anything like that, I know you said in Boston that CRISPR isn't even the technology you would use, but that I just can't even wrap my head. That sounds like you would take Leo, our son, in and hook him up to some computer or something. You know what I mean? I just don't even begin to wrap my head around how that treatment would actually work.
Yeah. It's a complicated question, so I'm going to give a brief answer, but we can certainly talk about it more some other time as well. Number one is I think about immediate supports that are available, and you talked about, for instance, spellers, and I just want to put it out to parents that are listening. I think we many times sometimes underestimate the ability of our young people and their ability to learn and their understanding of many things, that just because they have difficulty expressing this, in particular with verbal speech, I think we've underestimated many of them in terms of their capability. And I think increasingly technology and supports will allow them to speak in other ways. They may or may not do it as I'm doing right now, but whether it's spelling, whether it's other assisted communication. But I think that's really important in terms of improving their day-to-day functionality, what they're able to do, how they're able to integrate in communities and just have fuller lives. So let me say, I think that, those technologies, those supports are already available today, are important for us to integrate as part of their educational supports and systems. Beyond that, there could be multiple dimensions in terms of therapies. There may be pills or medicines, sort of traditionally what you think about. Those may end up being specific to MEF2C, or more likely they may help in terms of overall cognition. That is, they may not be specific for this group, but they may help with many other groups, because many of these genes come together and work together in that orchestra. And so there may be something that helps many conditions. And of course, that would be great if we could find things that helped many different groups. The next is what you were alluding to in terms of ways of being able to, if you will, manipulate the gene. There's some of those that are manipulating the gene in real time, but not permanently altering the gene. So it's like a volume knob where you might turn up the volume or turn down the volume. There are some of those technologies that I won't go into deeply today, but there are ways of doing that in a temporary way. Then that has a benefit and a sort of disadvantage as well, in the sense that you have to continuously apply whatever that medicine is to be able to, as I said, alter the volume as an example. The third category are ways that permanently affect the gene. And so these make permanent changes within the cells. In particular, my assumption is in the brain cells, where it might correct the MEF2C gene. And here's where I was alluding to, you have to know exactly the letter to correct, or letters to correct it in the right way. And so that's where people need to know if they're in the MEF2C club or some other club, and exactly what the alteration is. That's why I said, and I emphasize, this window of opportunity. If you're going to make those changes to the actual permanent changes, mind you, to the DNA, you want to make sure, because there could be some risk associated with that, you want to weigh those risks and benefits. And that scale may be balanced in a different way at different times over the life course. And so that's part of the reason I said that's one of those, to me, foundational important questions. That what is that window? How much good can you do if someone is 5 years old versus 15, 50 years old? And I just don't know the answer to that question. As part of that technology, it is important to do that safely, because that is a one and done type of treatment that has the advantage of just needing to do it one time. It also has the disadvantage of, once you do it, you can't undo it. And just to be transparent, there are concerns that that's done safely and very targeted and surgically. That is, you make the change that you need to make, but you don't accidentally alter any other genes that might have untoward consequences, like causing cancer, as an example. I don't want to scare people, but I do want to say that, this technology for brain conditions is still in the early stages. I'm excited that it is developing nicely. I spend a lot of time trying to think about what can we do to catalyze this and make it go faster, more safely, and spread it to more conditions, so that this group doesn't end up being too rare to care, that we use our collective sort of wisdom and experience to be able to spread that across the rare disease community. And I am optimistic that over the next decade, we're going to make significant advances there.
Just something I want to touch on real quickly. We don't have to spend time on it if there's just not a lot of data on it yet. But in the community, sort of the people we communicate with in the Facebook group and other places, 5-MTHF and leucovorin have come up a lot. And we've put Leo on 5-MTHF and have noticed subtle but significant improvements in his both receptive and expressive communication. So, like I said, if there's no data on how that could treat anything, I don't want to waste your time on it, but that might be an area of research that the parents might be interested in pursuing. So, but we'll wrap this up here. So what are you most excited about for the future? And what message would you give to someone who's just received a diagnosis?
So one of the things that I'm excited about is that we learn from each other, and that's the great thing about being part of this community. If you are newly diagnosed, it is an amazingly supportive community, and you have literally many. I think of it as an extended family with people who are Dr. Mom, Dr. Dad, who have lived with this 24/7. They've learned tips and tricks, practical life hacks in terms of how to be able to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And with this, researchers and doctors like myself that are trying to help the community think in a forward way and really think with the big picture, what's going to be needed while you're dealing with the day-to-day things and learning from each other. How do we have a strategy that's going to help us make what I hope are really quantum leaps forward and do it as quickly and safely as possible? In doing it, I just want to emphasize that it really takes the two groups working together quite smoothly. And I know it seems like a lot of work, but everyone really does matter. Getting those numbers counted in terms of representing helps us to advocate for resources, whether they're grant resources from institutes like the National Institutes of Health or other agencies around the world, from biotechnology and pharma companies. But being able to know those numbers, being able to understand what that lived experience is so that we can demonstrate what that unmet need is going forward, and then being able to understand what that journey is. As I said, understanding what the short and long-term effects are on the entire body. That's why we do things like in Simon Searchlight or here at Boston Children's Hospital, asking you a lot of questions. And it feels sometimes like we're asking the same questions over and over again. And that's because over time, we really do need to demonstrate that some things are changing and some things are not, because that'll help us as a comparator once we have a treatment to be able to compare and see if that treatment is doing anything in addition to just what naturally happens over the life course. So I know it's sometimes hard to understand why we do some of the things we do, but we're committed to giving you back that information and understanding it with you so that we can help all of us in terms of raising the next generation.
Awesome. Do you, in closing, do you have anything that you like, Simon Searchlight, anything you want to plug or anything like that?
No, just if you haven't signed up, go to Simon Searchlight, and it's easy to sign up, I hope. If you get stuck, we've got genetic counselors there to help you. And if you're already signed up, just continue. We, as I said, continue to follow people over the life course to be able to continue to support them and hopefully help as we're developing treatments.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to all our listeners. As always, you can contact us on Facebook, email, mef2ccast@gmail.com. If you like the show, please subscribe. That helps us out a lot. And have a great day.